Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A.IdlePodcast, the podcast where I do weekly book reviews. This week, I read The Four Agreements, A Practical Guide to Personal Freedom by Don Miguel Ruiz. Released in 1997, this Toltec Wisdom Book explains the spirituality of the Naguals through self-agreement. What we find is that this knowledge is essentially esoteric, being you don't usually come across this mindset in most other self-help books. I would say one that you can kind of compare this way of thinking to would be The Alchemist. That's very adjacent to the message of this book. And according to Business Balls and Omaratani websites, this is an inspirational code for life that deconstructs reality. Now, if you haven't heard of Miguel Ruiz, he has plenty of other books. He is described as a spiritual teacher, and he's a renowned author. And if you're looking for more information or you want to buy more books directly from him, you can go to miguelruiz.com. Now, this way of thinking and Ruiz as a person fall under the Toltec umbrella, which is just essentially Southern Mexican men and women of this type of knowledge and this type of wisdom. Now, the Nagual, which I mentioned just a few seconds ago, are considered the masters of this ancestral wisdom. And so Ruiz himself is a Nagual. And all of this is explained very early on in the book, just to give you some sort of standing and why you should trust this author and why he is, certified to give you this information. It's because he comes from a long line of people who have practiced this way of thinking and these teachings. Now, his other works include The Mastery of Love, The Voice of Knowledge, The Fifth Agreement, The Mastery of Life, and there's several others. And I actually purchased this book in a pack of 3, and it came with The Mastery of Love, and I think The Voice of Knowledge. I believe those are the other 2 that came with this one. So now, what we get established in this book are the 4 agreements. And these are agreements to yourself, which is very important, and we're going to discuss that a little more when we get down to the themes. So the first agreement is be impeccable with your word. So this includes things like honoring promises that you have spoken, but more importantly, the emphasis on the power of the tongue, which is something that is discussed in many other religions. And it's just understanding that you speaking something out into the world, it does hold weight. And if you choose to ignore that, then you're being irresponsible with your word. So we come across this conversation on magic versus black magic. So when you speak something, that's considered, magic. It's almost like you're casting a spell. And so when you misuse that, for example, gossiping or spreading hatred, that's black magic. And an example that was given in the book is, or I don't think this is in the book, I think this is an example I scribbled in the margins, but for example, Hitler. So, his words were very charismatic, and they moved people in the wrong direction and for the wrong reasons. But that's an example of how powerful your words can be. And so on the flip side, what you need to understand is that you have to harness that and be good with your word. Don't just speak things recklessly. In this day and age, it's very easy to just speak whatever you wish on social media, but just being mindful of the things that you put out into the universe. So the way that we enforce this is just mindfulness, simply. So it's very easy. So the second agreement is don't take anything personally. I really like the discussion on this in general outside of this book, but also inside of this book, because it highlights this idea of personal importance. And when you really think about it, if you think that everyone around you is doing things to either piss you off or make you feel good, that's very narcissistic. And what we have to understand is that most of the time, if not all of the time, people are acting on their own accordance. So not everything has to do with you. In fact, most of what is happening around you has nothing to do with you. So you shouldn't take any actions personally. If you're encountering someone who is angry, for example, if you work in retail, which is probably one of the worst jobs I've ever had in my life, just because of the people you encounter, it's very hard not to take different attitudes personally, because it's you, they're speaking to, when really it could be something like, something really bad just happened in their lives and they're just kind of, spewing whatever it is at whoever's closest to them or something. So it's important to just look inside yourself rather outside. And I think that's part of the enforcement is introspection. It's just understanding that you're really only in control of what happens inside of you. You're never in control of other people's actions. Therefore, don't take it personally what they say or do. It's not your problem or your responsibility. The third agreement, I just clicked out of my document here. Okay, the third agreement is don't make assumptions. So this is, of course, a part of this. And what we find is that Ruiz constructed this book so that obviously the agreements can build off of one another. So you get to this point and it makes a lot of sense once you've read this far why you should not make assumptions. So like I said before, everyone thinks and feels like I do is a very detrimental mindset because it's untrue. No one thinks the same. So therefore, something that you may think is like a slight towards you, someone else is not even thinking about it, So the way we enforce this is communication and, more importantly, courage. The courage to initiate that communication. If it bothers you that much, maybe you should address it. So this can come in handy when we're talking about close relationships, whether it's friendships, professional, coworkers. And this is one thing that I will say, it's easy, like once you finally put a stop to your assuming, it's easier to just come out and be like, well, what did you mean about that? Like, I don't want to assume, like, what did you really mean? It's easier to come out and ask that. So that's a really good agreement here. And the last one is always do your best, which is surprising because this is something that we're kind of told in elementary school. And I think that people have deconstructed the meaning of this phrase to meaning that, well, your best doesn't really count. But in reality, it does. Now, I'm not saying that you doing your best is going to get you to being the richest person in the world, but you have to make a commitment to yourself and understand that the best changes from day to day. So I relate to this kind of like in the gym. Listen, my best, especially when we're talking like on the treadmill, it changes every day because I'm aching, whatever. But as long as I know that during that workout, I did my best at that day, we're good to go because I'm keeping up with it. So I think the enforcement here is just commitment. So that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about your best. It doesn't mean to do the bare minimum and expect for things to go your way. It means literally do the best that you can in that moment for that time period. If you're sick and you just don't feel good, do whatever you can in that moment. What if you're working on a project or something like that? And if that means you need to lay back down, then you need to lay back down. But don't flip it into, I'm going to be lazy today and that's my best. No. Do whatever the best means for you in that moment. Okay, so this book is very short, but it does include a lot. So first we open up with the acknowledgements. Then we have a chapter titled The Toltec, which is essentially just the context of the Toltec wisdom, which is important because you have to understand where this information is coming from before you actually get to it. After that, we have an introduction. And what I liked about the introduction was that there was an emphasis on collectivity. So us being one people, we're all in this together. And it was very, I want to say mind-opening because that doesn't sound right, but it reminded me that we're all on this planet together. So, we have to have some sort of compassion for one another. And I think once you're able to have compassion for other people, it's easier for you to have compassion for yourself. So I enjoyed the introduction simply because he broke it down to say, look, we're all one. We're all here together. We're on Earth together, flying in space, So that was good. And then after that, we have a chapter titled Domestication and the Dream of the Planet, which was very interesting. And I think that's probably where, if you were to be turned off by this book, I think that's where people will be turned off, but I'll get to that in a moment. Then you have the agreements, which one chapter each, and that's kind of the self-help feel of this book, followed by the new dream, which can be summed up in one quote. Moses called it the promised land, Buddha called it nirvana, Jesus called it heaven, and the Toltecs call it a new dream. I love statements like this, and I saw one on Instagram, which, Instagram is usually a very shallow place, but it was very similar to this, and it was something about vibes, and it was saying how, I wish I had it pulled up, but something about, the streets call it bad vibes, science calls it your gut instinct, whatever it is, trust it. I love statements like that because it shows us that we all understand each other. We just call it different things. So we all know, we know what we're talking about here. And when it comes to the new dream, he puts it into the perspective of religion so that no matter what religion you're a part of, you understand what he's saying when he means the new dream. It's that point of being so happy. You're in heaven, So I thought that was the most perfect quote. And lastly, there is a chapter for prayers. And there are specific prayers for freedom and love, which essentially targets what a lot of people crave and what a lot of people need. So that was nice that was included. Okay, so really, honestly, the theme of this book is empowerment. And that is shown through the discussion on accountability, where we're talking about the mindset. You have the power to create heaven or hell, but you have to give yourself permission to be happy, essentially. So that's really what we're talking about here when we say accountability. And there was one point in this book when he talked about how some people are just addicted to being unhappy and addicted to being miserable, and they don't really know that. But it is a choice. You don't have to walk around life and be mad all the time or be stressed out all the time. You don't have to. Life is hard and everything, but you have to change your mindset and make the decision to be happy and then go from there. And I think the reason people struggle with that so much is because accountability is tough, and they don't want to admit that it's them that is stressing themselves out. And I think we all know someone in our lives, whether it's a boss or a coworker. I see this all the time in the corporate world where it's people stress themselves out. People make things bigger than they need to be. And I'm not saying things don't come up when it's nail biting and it's difficult and it's time consuming, but we don't need to come to work. Oh, here's another day. Oh, here's something else I have to do. That's a choice to continue to be miserable. So I did like the emphasis on the whole accountability thing. And then also when it comes to empowerment, self-regulation. So this is kind of, hand in hand with accountability. So if you choose to follow these agreements, they will ultimately dictate the success of your life. But the way how you manage that is going to determine how successful, according to you, that you are with that. No one can really regulate your emotions except you. Things can happen and things can make you sad and events can make you upset and angry, but it's in your ability to manage those emotions properly and not let the negative ones get the best of you. And I love the way that he put it. He called it a parasite, where all of those negative feelings and disgusting behaviors and gossiping and stuff like that. He called that whole energy, that whole aura, a parasite. And I love that he described it that way, because that's really what it is. Because negativity really eats at you. And if you don't believe me, find someone who's been negative their whole life and look at their state of being. Not very good, physically or mentally. So make that decision to self-regulate and be accountable for your own emotions and your words, and go from there. And we're going to close this out with the quote from towards the end of the book. The only reason you are happy is because you choose to be happy. Happiness is a choice, and so is suffering. Now, the reception of this is very good. It's been out for years, came out in 97, and it's been translated in 48 different languages. And there's this overall acknowledgement of the creed of the agreements. So people around the world, really take this information in stride and apply it to their lives. And I think I read something, but it was on Wikipedia, so I don't know how true it is, that Tom Brady, I guess when that whole Deflategate thing happened, he was really into these agreements, and that got him through it or something like that, which is not far-fetched at all, but just a random fact. Now, Ruiz has also been interviewed by both Oprah and Ellen. I haven't looked these up, but I know that he was on Oprah's Super Soul podcast. So I'm assuming that information is still available out there if you want to listen to some more of his thoughts. Now, I think personally that this is a very simple guide with memorable agreements. So I've said in the past how important it is for information to be concise, because in this day and age, the success of the comprehension of information, it really lies in how concise the information is. And so having 4 agreements that you can say very quickly, be impeccable with your word, that's very quick, and that's something you can remember, is in itself a success, because people will be able to reference, that information fairly quickly in their memory. Now, like I said before, I think that the Toltec spirituality will lose some people. If there was a part where people will get lost, I think it's that part, because the idea that we're all one, a lot of people don't want to acknowledge that for various reasons. The world is divided by so many different things, and when you really think about it, it's stupid, because we're all human, we're all here at the same time. And which is in itself amazing, because, how long has the earth been around, and we're all here on this earth at the same time. But also the idea that reality is technically a shared dream. And the way you change that is by just changing the way that you're thinking and the way that you do things. And I think people don't really want to see it as that easy. It really is easy. And implementing these agreements is easy. The hard part is breaking what we already know, quote unquote, because we've been acting like this for so long. It's difficult to break the habit of being a miserable person and being someone who spreads suffering and, all that jazz. So, yeah, I think that'll be kind of like the toughest part, because it gets really, what's the word? Esoteric, I guess. That's the only thing jumping out at me, because it's actually in the book, but I think that's a great way to describe it. Whereas there are going to be certain people that get this, and there are going to be certain people that don't. So, it just requires a prior expansion of your mindset. So you already have to be in the state of mind that like you're committed to reassess yourself and your way of thinking. If you're already committed to staying the same and never changing, you're not going to get anything out of this book. So, is this a reread? Yes, of course. It's one of those books that is a great reference guide, like The Alchemist. It's something that's very short, so it doesn't require you to block off an entire weekend. In fact, I would classify this as like a coffee read. You can read this in the morning before everyone gets up. You can get up and have like an hour and just read through, if not all of it, most of it, and get some good information and start your day. And that's actually how I read it. I read it before I got to the gym. And I go really early, so it's nice and peaceful. It's very quiet. And I had like 10 minutes before each gym session, and I would just, read this book every now and then. So, I definitely will be keeping this book on my shelf, and I want to get the rest of his books here so I can read them all. But I definitely think it's in the same field as The Alchemist, and I love that book. So I really only have one takeaway, and funnily enough, it's one of the agreements. Don't take anything personally. I think that is the most important one, because I don't want to say because of cancel culture, but kind of, where everyone's in this mindset now where they're like looking for things to be offended by. Listen, people do some crazy stuff, but don't take it personally, especially on the internet. And if you find yourself taking it personally, you should delete the internet, because the internet is not real. It's fake. People on there are just saying whatever to get a rise out of everyone else. And not that this isn't important for everyday life, but it's really important now not to take anything personally. Ever. Just as a motto. So yeah, I enjoy this book, and it's funny because I read this like 2 years ago at the start of the pandemic, and I didn't remember anything but the agreements. I think it's because I had the agreements on my office wall at the time, because I hated that job. And it's funny because I kind of like subconsciously started holding myself to these agreements, and now I find myself like repeating, be impeccable with your word, don't just speak things out into the universe that could be harmful and things like that. So I think that's definitely proof that if you really read to understand and absorb the information, this can be something that can be helpful for you for the rest of your life, So yeah, I enjoyed it. You can bet that there's going to be reviews on the other 2 books that I have by Ruiz coming soon. I don't know when, but we'll figure it out. Life is really busy, but busy is a blessing, so I am not complaining. But thank you for tuning in to another episode. I will see you guys again. Have a good one. Thank you.